In March 2022, the United States was convinced that Russia was going to win the conflict decisively. And there was therefore a need to be resisting of any requests for heavy military equipment because the United States believed that that would eventually compel NATO to get involved, and that would be a direct conflict with Russia, and that would be World War III. But when it became clear that Russia wasn't invading using hard methods, the special military operation was very soft, comparatively so. The United States and others misinterpreted this as a sign of weakness on the part of Russia. And they began the process of interfering with peace talks. And we saw that with Boris Johnson on April 1st, stopping the Istanbul peace negotiations. And they began providing billions of dollars worth of military assistance to Ukraine in an effort to assist them in the defeat of the Russians. But even then, the concern was not to escalate unnecessarily and thereby force Russia into a counter-escalation. The belief was simply by providing this training, this artillery, and some old Soviet-era equipment that the Ukrainian military would be able to push the Russians back. And indeed, the victories in Kharkov and on the right bank of Kherson seemed to prove them correct. But it was an absolute misreading of the situation. The Russians not only stopped the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but went, mobilized, and they're in the process now of building up a powerful military capability for which Ukraine has no answer to, literally no answer. The United States and NATO having committed to a course of action which was contingent upon the supply of sufficient military equipment to the Ukrainian military so they could accomplish the task. We're now faced with an impossible problem. How do you continue to send equipment to the Ukrainian military knowing there is no way they can win? I mean, just take a look at everything that's coming out right now. Everybody is acknowledging Ukraine's lost. There's nothing that can be done. For political reasons, the United States has to be seen as doing everything possible to allow Ukraine a chance to win because they know Ukraine's going to lose. Biden knows that his administration is going to have to answer very difficult questions about how did Russia win this war? And they want to make sure that when that time comes, they can say, we did everything. We gave Ukraine everything they asked for, including tanks, even though back in March he said it meant World War III. Under normal circumstances, it could have meant World War III, but see, the circumstances have changed between March and today. Back in March, the United States, was transitioning into the mode that Russia was weak. Russia couldn't win the war. Today, we know that Russia is strong and that Russia will win the war. Two totally different mindsets. Back then, we provided weaponry, genuinely believing that this would help Ukraine defeat Russia. Today, we know Ukraine can't defeat Russia, but we have to go through the political motions of being seen as assisting. And this is actually not just a tragedy, but it's a condemnation of the United States, because what we're saying is, in order to look good politically, we're going to sacrifice tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. That's despicable.
And as you said, it's really tragic because the state is destroyed, society is destroyed. Why it's so amazing that why they are continuing sending weapons and weapons and weapons and billions of money of dollar to Ukraine, but it doesn't help ordinary Ukrainians.
Well, it's even worse than that. We sent it knowing that Ukraine is the most corrupt nation on the planet. And we sent it knowing that this corrupt nation was stealing this money blind. We sent it knowing that 7 out of 10, every $10 we sent ended up in the pockets of Ukrainian politicians and corrupt officials. We did this knowing that we were wasting U.S. taxpayer money. We refused to allow an inspector general to be installed to oversee the accounting of this money. We didn't want to ask how it was being spent because we knew how it was being spent. We knew the corruption that was going on. This was always a political game designed to create the perception of a powerful Ukraine, knowing all along that Ukraine could never win this war. I mean, that's the disgusting part of this. We have been literally funding corruption. And now, you know, I love the hypocrisy of the United States. Now, the Pentagon and the State Department are approaching the Ukraine saying, you must account for every single dollar. Well, that's because we have a Republican Congress right now who's saying we need to account for every single dollar before we send more. And the reality is Ukrainians can't account for it because 70% of it just disappeared, was stolen. I mean, Zelensky might be able to account for the money that he personally stole, but all the other people, they're not going to admit to it. So this is the United States has knowingly facilitated the destruction of Ukraine as a modern nation state. I mean, yes, it's Zelensky's fault. Yes, it's his government's fault. Yes, Europe is complicit in this crime. But America is the one that made this war possible. We're the one that not only created the policies that led to this war, but we're the ones that led the world in sustaining this conflict, knowing all along we would never be there for the Ukrainian people. Never be there for the Ukrainian people. This should be a lesson to everybody in the world. In fact, I'm just going to make it clear. Hey, out there in the world, wake up. America's not your friend. America will never be your friend. America will always abandon you. America will always bleed you dry. America will always cause your men to die. America will always cause your women and children to flee and become refugees. America doesn't care about you at all. America will never care about you at all. You exist to serve America. America will never serve you. We are the colonial masters. You are the colonial servants, and never forget your place.
By refusing to act decisively and end the conflict quickly, the Kremlin has allowed the West to essentially take control of the war and expand it and expand it and expand it. And the West is now confident that when the Kremlin declares a red line, it means nothing. Absolutely nothing, because none have ever been enforced. And so this means the West will get more reckless. And so this is the sort of situation. It plays into the hands of the neoconservatives' view we can reestablish American primacy, American hegemony. And what is convincing them is the lack of any Russian action to end the conflict, other than through negotiation. Now, when the Americans look at this, they say, well, look, how many times has Lavrov and Putin said that every time they negotiate with the West, they get deceived, that they'll never trust them again, and yet they want to have another negotiation. So what I'm illustrating, I think, or I hope I'm illustrating, is that the West is now confident, or the neoconservatives are. I think most of the people have no idea what's going on. But the neoconservatives who control and define American foreign policy are now confident that they can reestablish the hegemony that the U.S. had. And they're so confident that they're carrying the same kinds of provocations to China. It's beginning with Taiwan. The U.S. is, in effect, disavowing the one China policy that dates, I think, from 1973 or 1974 during during President Nixon's term, when the United States acknowledged one China. We supported removing Taiwan from the Security Council of the UN and putting China in its place. Well, now it looks like we're trying to backpedal as part of a provocation of China. So why would the United States want to cause warlike situation with two powerful countries that are nuclear armed? And the only explanation is the neoconservative insistence on American hegemony. And so this is a situation that I think the Kremlin is equally responsible for. And what needed to be done, if there's to be an intervention, it needed to be a very quick, hard, decisive strike that ended the thing in a few weeks before the West could get involved. Instead, the way the Kremlin proceeded, it gave the West forever to get involved, and they still have forever. We really don't know what's going to happen next. But there's no sign of the Russian army. As far as I can tell, the Russian army is really not involved in conflict. It's being fought by the Wagner Group, which is a private military group with some relationship to the Russian army, but it's not the Russian army, and the two Donbass militias. So, we hear about mobilizations, but there's no Russian army. Where's the Russian army? How can the Kremlin let this drag on like this? It's achieving terrible results for Russia and for Europe, because the West gets more and more convinced that it can get a good result out of this. I mean, they look at Russia like a joke. It doesn't do anything.
You think that they thought that Ukraine can defeat Russia?
Well, it's 14 months. There's been no advance in a long time.
But I talked with Scott Ritter recently. He said that those troops that were trained and equipped by NATO during 8 years, they're all gone right now. It's you and you said that Russia didn't use its army in this war. If Russia didn't use its army and killed all those Ukrainian trained and equipped by NATO, how United States can think of winning in Ukraine?
Well, if they kill the army, but the Russian forces still haven't advanced. They haven't advanced since, it's been months. And we don't know if they kill the army or not. There's very poor reporting. Now, Scott Ritter just can't believe that Ukraine could face Russia. None of us could believe that. But they've done it now for 14, 15 months. And when I say where's the Russian army, it's not committed. It's not actually in the war. As far as, you never hear anything about a Russian. You hear about the Wagner Group. And all the news reporting is the Wagner Group, and it's the two independent republic militias. Well, they have to be worn down because they've been fighting since 2014. First trying to hold on to the Donbass, and then once the Wagner Group came into Donbass, they've been fighting to advance. Now, they made initial advances, long before the Ukrainian army was destroyed. They made initial advances. And then they had to pull back because they didn't have enough troops to man the frontiers they had established. And they've never really gone forward again. And now, and what we've heard for several months now is negotiation talk. The Russians keep saying, we're ready to negotiate. But it has to be, you know, our terms. Well, why are they ready to negotiate when they've said over and over and over, every time we negotiate, we get deceived? And they want to be deceived again? You have to understand, when the neoconservatives are looking at this, they're looking at a totally, they see, what they see is a totally ineffective opponent. They can't make a single good decision. The neoconservatives were worried that the Russian army would hit Ukraine and the whole thing would be over in a week and NATO would be scared to death and everybody would resign from NATO. The neoconservatives were afraid that a real attack would have shattered NATO because everybody would have said, my word, look at that. We don't want that kind of enemy. We don't need NATO anymore. We need peace. And they were worried that the NATO would simply disband because nobody would want to be in it because they didn't want to be presented as a possible enemy of Russia. Well, Putin missed that opportunity. Just like he missed the opportunity to intervene in the Maidan Revolution. I mean, that's when the Russians should have gone in. Instead, they let the Americans take over. You can't make a succession of errors like this without convincing the neoconservatives that you're not a problem. There'll be more trouble somewhere. Central Asia, the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, they're all, I'm sure the CIA's in there. I mean, now this can make it sound like I'm on Russia's side. No, I fear that the result of this is going to be a nuclear war and we're all going to be dead. And that's why I speak out about it. You know, I think that the Kremlin is helping along a nuclear war by conveying indecision, weakness, inability to act decisively. They talk decisively, but they never follow up. And so we have a situation that has encouraged more and more Western involvement and has built the confidence of the neoconservatives. It wasn't long ago that Victoria Nuland, who's now, you know, promoted up, she's the Undersecretary of State. She probably runs the State Department. And she says, oh, we're going to take Crimea back. It's time to take Crimea back. Well, she wouldn't say that if she didn't believe it could be done. Well, why does she believe it can be done? I don't believe it can be done, but she believes it because they've been watching the Kremlin's reactions and they don't see an effective opponent. And so we now, I think we've had missiles now hitting inside Russia. I mean, they don't do any real damage, but it's great propaganda. And why does Putin want missiles landing in Russia? And so to the neoconservatives who are determined to have American hegemony, when they see that the main power opposing them is indecisive and incapable of acting, they get confident. That's a danger because it at some point, the Kremlin is going to be pushed into a corner where it either has to surrender or act. And when it acts, it will act decisively, and there's when you have the wars. So this is what I emphasize. I'm not trying to give Putin a plan to win. I'm trying to give Putin a plan to avoid the sort of ongoing provocations that lead to a serious war. And
But it seems that Ukraine is so different for Russia. Scott Ritter said when United States went to Iraq, they brought down everything. But you see that Putin didn't do anything like that. I don't know the mindset of Putin, what he want to do, but it must be some, because between United States and Iraq there was no cultural ties, but between Ukraine was once part of Russia. There are families in Russian families in Ukraine, and Russian families.
I know this argument, but you're going to say, because of cultural ties, we'll let the path go on to nuclear war.
I see.
I mean, nothing is worth nuclear war. And so having not intervened in 2014, having refused, if Putin had taken Donbass back in 2014, none of this could have happened. The Ukraine would not have attacked Russia herself then. And so instead, he gives them 8 more years to build confidence, and these neo-Nazis are running everything. It just gets out of control. How do you have to stop these things early or they spiral out of control. And they don't stop them at all. He's not doing anything to stop this. And does he think that somehow Germany and France and the U.S., who've sold him out time after time, the Minsk Agreement and everything else, that somehow they're going to come rescue him? No, they're not. The only thing that can stop this is some decisive Russian military action that ends it. And then Russia establishes the government instead of America establishing the government. And then that shows the world that the Russians are serious and that they're not putting up with this. And then everybody says, well, we tried, but it was a mistake. We better not try it again. But as long as it's working for the neoconservatives, they're going to keep trying. It's simple to see that. I don't understand why Putin doesn't see it. And, if I was the president, of the United States, I'd be concerned about the neoconservatives because ultimately it's going to end into a provocation that cannot be overlooked. And, when you go to war, the goal is to end it as quick as you can, not to let it drag out and drag out. And the longer it drags out, the more the West is involved. The more the West is involved, the less likely they are going to let it go. How long before if the Ukrainian army is worn out and dead, like Scott Ritter says, then what do we get next? Polish troops, American troops? There are 20,000 American troops deployed in Romania on the border, waiting. I've seen reports large numbers of Polish troops are deployed, waiting, because Poland wants to take part of Ukraine for itself. So, what happens then?
How do you see the future of Ukraine? By saying that, how do you see the future of Ukraine?
It probably doesn't have one. But why why does anybody think the West cares about Ukraine? It only cares, it's a weapon against Russia. And the U.S. has used it successfully to break all business relationships between Europe and Russia and to destroy the gas pipelines. So, this has worked tremendously for the United States. It's done this invasion, or it's not an invasion, this intervention by Russia has done nothing for Russia. But for the U.S., it's recaptured Europe. It's not going to, and Europe has lost its fear of Russia. You listen to the NATO General Secretary. He talks to Russia like it was some sort of two-bit banana republic. You listen to the way the British talk about Russia, like, we're going to beat them up tomorrow. And you see just little countries now arrogant toward Russia. This is not good. This never happened during the Cold War. There was never a time when the United States was arrogant toward Russia, toward the Soviet Union. Nobody would have risked that. It was dangerous. We were trying to reduce tensions, not elevate them. But we've been elevating tensions now for years. I was part of the Cold War. I can say with full confidence that the tensions today are much higher than they ever were, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And during the Cold War in the United States, there were two sides. There was a debate, how you best deal with the Soviet Union. Today, there's only one side. You impose hegemony on them. There's nobody saying, other than me, Stephen Cohen died a few years ago, so there were two of us. Now there's one who says, wait a minute, this is dangerous. You're not going to win, neoconservatives. You're going to provoke a worse war, a bad war with nuclear weapons. You're going to provoke that. That's where this is headed. And I'm telling the same thing to the Kremlin. When you show acceptance of endless provocations, you're going to get more provocations, and they're going to get worse. So I'm not on either side. I want to avoid the final provocation where everything goes boom. Because I don't think the Russians are going to surrender. I don't think the Chinese are either. And as long as the neoconservatives think they can push and push without any real consequence, they're going to push. And that's the situation. It's obvious. I don't see why people have any trouble understanding it. It's so obvious. And but it goes on.
You think that what would be the solution to this war in Ukraine? You think negotiations or
No.
complete defeat of Ukraine?
The solution is Russia has to close the place down. They can do that simply with missiles. They can take out all the power generation. They can take out all the water systems. They can take out all the public transportation, all the railroads, the train stations, the roads. They could drop parachute troops to seal off Western Ukraine from NATO and the U.S. The whole thing would be over with in a week. They go into Kiev, hang Zelensky as a war criminal, put in a government, establish a government, ignore the West, ignore the UN, but get the job done. Nobody can interfere. Nobody can intervene. When a country that has the potential of power uses it, the opposition isn't all that anxious to try to confront them directly with troops. It's just not, you know, and I can see very quickly the Germans would say, oh, what if the Russians hit Berlin? I can see the French say, oh, what if they hit Paris? Well, we can't stop it. We can't do anything about it. So let's not antagonize them. But instead, the Russians just show weakness and more indecision.